was difficult, especially moving into Graceland. He already had his inner circle, and of course they embraced me, but I never realized that was it. I mean, he didn't really go out. We truly lived in a bubble.
August 16th, 1977, the king of rock and roll is dead, and within hours, the machinery of grief begins its grotesque work. Flowers arrive by the truckload. Fans collapse outside Graceland's gates. The world mourns in unison, united in the belief that they've lost someone irreplaceable. But there's another story happening behind those mansion walls, one that nobody outside a very small circle will understand for weeks. One that involves a woman who thought she owned a piece of forever and was about to discover she owned nothing at all. Priscilla Presley is 32 years old when she gets the call. She's not at Graceland. She's living her own life now, separate, independent in ways she never imagined possible when she was the teenage girl Elvis plucked from Germany and remade in his image. Their marriage ended 5 years earlier, officially divorced in 1972, but Priscilla had spent those intervening years convincing herself of a fundamental truth: she would always be taken care of. Not because Elvis loved her anymore, that had died long ago in their relationship, but because she was Lisa Marie's mother. Because she'd given him the best years of her life. Because no matter what happened between them romantically, there was an unspoken contract between two people who'd been bound together at the most impossible moment of his fame. But contracts, as it turns out, can be rewritten. And Elvis, in his final months, had done exactly that. The will reading happens in the offices of Elvis's attorneys in Memphis, a gray, fluorescent space that smells like old leather and older money. Priscilla sits across from men in suits who are carefully avoiding eye contact with her. She's brought her own lawyer, someone who understands that being an ex-wife to the most famous musician in history means you need to be ready for anything. But nothing could have prepared her for this. Nothing could have prepared anyone. The lawyer reading the will speaks in that particular monotone, reserved for delivering devastating news. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, receives significant portions of the estate. The Memphis Mafia, the inner circle of friends and employees who've lived off Elvis's generosity for decades, are taken care of with cash bequests and ongoing employment guarantees. Lisa Marie, Elvis's only child, is the primary beneficiary, which makes perfect sense to anyone listening. She's 9 years old. She's innocent. She deserves the kingdom her father built. But Priscilla, the woman who'd spent 14 years of her life married to Elvis Presley, the woman who'd given birth to his only heir, the woman who'd stood beside him through his comeback, his decline, his pharmaceutical spiral, Priscilla, receives nothing. Not the mansion, not the investments, not a percentage of his publishing rights, not even a symbolic piece of his legacy. The will is designed with such precision that it's impossible to read it as an accident. This wasn't an oversight. This was architecture. When it sinks in, really sinks in, Priscilla's first instinct is to rationalize. Surely there's an explanation. Surely Elvis meant to amend it. Surely this was a draft, an old version, something from before they'd worked things out or before he'd thought better of it. But the dates don't support that narrative. The will had been reviewed recently. Elvis had signed it with full awareness of what it contained. He'd made amendments just months before his death, refining it, clarifying it, making sure there were no loopholes for her to slip through. The lawyer presents another document, Elvis's personal notes about the will, written in his own hand, attempting to explain his reasoning. And there it is, the knife twist that makes everything worse. Elvis had written that he was disinheriting Priscilla not out of oversight, but out of deliberate choice. The wording is vague, but pointed. It references past conduct and fundamental breaches of trust. It mentions her attempts to exert control over my affairs and my person. It's the kind of language that suggests not a simple divorce disagreement, but a profound betrayal, the kind that a man would carry to his grave. Priscilla leaves that attorney's office in a state of shock that will take her weeks to process into something she can actually articulate. She's been erased. not just removed from the will, but actively excluded. The distinction matters. It means Elvis had thought about her. He'd considered what he was doing, and he'd decided she deserved nothing. The public doesn't immediately understand the significance of this moment. When news of the will becomes public knowledge in the days and weeks following Elvis's death, most people accept the narrative that it makes sense Lisa Marie gets the bulk of the estate, Vernon is taken care of, and the Memphis Mafia receives their payments. It seems reasonable, almost kind in its distribution. But anyone who knew Priscilla, anyone who'd followed Elvis's life closely, understood what had really happened. They understood that this was a message. A final statement from a man who couldn't say it to her face because he was already gone. And what made it even more devastating was that Priscilla actually tried to fight it. She hired attorneys. She filed challenges claiming Elvis was mentally incompetent at the time he'd signed the will. She argued that her rights as the mother of his child should grant her some claim to his legacy. But every legal avenue she pursued led to a dead end, sometimes literally running into walls of silence from people in Elvis's inner circle who refused to testify about his mental state, his reasoning, or the conversations they'd had with him about Priscilla in those final months. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. The will was airtight. The intent was unmistakable. And what nobody could explain, not publicly anyway, was the real reason behind it. Why would a man completely erase the woman who'd borne his child? What had happened between them that was so catastrophic, so unforgivable in Elvis's mind, that he couldn't even allow her a symbolic piece of his empire? The answer to that question would take years to uncover. It would require looking back into the decade they'd spent apart, into the business dealings they'd conducted, into the personal betrayals that happened when nobody was watching. It would require understanding that Priscilla hadn't just been his wife, she'd been someone Elvis believed had betrayed him in ways that cut far deeper than infidelity or simple incompatibility. And in his final months, as his mind became increasingly clear about what mattered and what didn't, Elvis had made a choice that would echo through her life forever. To understand why Elvis erased Priscilla from his will, you have to go back to 1972, the year their marriage officially ended. But the real story doesn't begin with divorce papers or lawyers. It begins with a simple truth that nobody wanted to admit. They had already stopped being a couple years before they made it legal. The woman Elvis had married in 1967, full of hope and the desperate belief that love could survive even the machinery of Hollywood, had transformed into someone he no longer recognized. And worse, from Elvis's perspective, she'd become someone he believed was actively working against him. The early 70s are glossed over in most Elvis biographies. People talk about his Vegas performances, his comeback special in '68, the albums he recorded. What they don't talk about is the psychological warfare happening behind closed doors at Graceland. By 1970, Priscilla had stopped being the dutiful wife who existed in Elvis's shadow. She'd discovered independence, confidence, and most troubling to Elvis, she'd developed her own opinions about how his life should be managed. She started questioning his choices. She challenged his doctors about the medications they were prescribing. She suggested that his managers were taking advantage of him, that Colonel Parker's deals weren't in his best interest, that the people surrounding him weren't always acting out of love. From one perspective, Priscilla was trying to save him. From Elvis's perspective, she was trying to control him. The turning point came in 1971 when Priscilla discovered something that would fundamentally alter how Elvis saw her. She'd been going through financial documents not secretively, not out of paranoia, but as part of her responsibility managing household expenses when she uncovered a series of business dealings that Vernon and Colonel Parker had kept hidden from Elvis. These weren't small transactions. There were major agreements that affected Elvis's future earnings, his publishing rights, his creative control over his own work. When Priscilla brought this information to Elvis, expecting gratitude for protecting his interests, she got something entirely different. She got rage. Elvis didn't see her as a protector. He saw her as someone who'd been snooping through his private affairs, someone who was trying to position herself as his business advisor, someone who wanted power over his empire. The fact that she'd been right that Parker and Vernon were indeed making deals that weren't entirely in his favor made it worse, not better. Because it meant she had leverage. It meant she could hold this information over his head. It meant she'd cross from being his wife into being something more dangerous, someone who understood his vulnerabilities and could exploit them. The arguments that followed were unlike anything their marriage had seen before. Elvis accused her of being ambitious, of marrying him not for love, but for access to his wealth and influence. He reminded her of where she'd come from, a military dependent in Germany, and where she was now a woman who'd built an entire identity on being Mrs. Elvis Presley. He questioned whether she'd ever loved him at all, or if she'd simply been a very patient, very strategic gold digger. The words were designed to wound, and they did. But what they also did was establish a new dynamic in their relationship: fundamental distrust. Priscilla's response was to pull back, to stop trying to help, to stop involving herself in his business affairs. But Elvis interpreted this withdrawal as confirmation of his suspicions. If she wasn't trying to help him anymore, it was because she'd gotten what she wanted and didn't need to maintain the facade anymore. The logic was circular and paranoid, but it was how Elvis was beginning to think about the woman he'd married. By 1972, when they formally separated, the emotional distance had become complete. But it was what happened during their divorce proceedings that truly poisoned any remaining goodwill between them. Priscilla hired aggressive attorneys who fought for every advantage they could get for her and Lisa Marie. This was standard divorce procedure, nothing unusual by any measurement of normal conflict. But Elvis experienced it as a betrayal of the highest order. He'd taken care of her. He'd made her. He'd given her everything. And now she was fighting him in court, trying to extract as much money from him as possible, trying to leverage custody of their daughter as a bargaining chip. What Elvis didn't fully understand, or perhaps refused to understand, was that Priscilla was doing what any reasonable person would do in her position. She was protecting herself and her child's future. She had no career to fall back on. Her entire identity had been constructed around being Elvis's wife. And now that identity was dissolving, she had to fight for financial security because nobody was going to hand it to her simply because she'd been loyal. But Elvis saw it as greed. He saw it as proof that everything he'd suspected was true. She'd used him. She'd played the role of devoted wife perfectly until she could extract maximum value from the relationship. And now that the marriage was over, she was showing her true face. The relationship between them deteriorated into something toxic and performative. They had to see each other because of Lisa Marie. They had to communicate about custody and visitation, but every interaction became laden with subtext, with accusations, with the weight of broken promises and perceived betrayals. Elvis would make snide comments about Priscilla's new life, her dating, her attempts to rebuild herself as something other than his ex-wife. Priscilla would respond with coldness that only confirmed his belief that she'd never truly cared about him. And then, in 1973, Priscilla made a choice that Elvis would never forgive. She started dating Mike Stone, a karate instructor who taught Lisa Marie. To Elvis, this wasn't simply infidelity, it was the ultimate humiliation. It was Priscilla choosing to be with another man while still collecting alimony from him, while still using his name, while still benefiting from his wealth. It was her publicly demonstrating that she'd moved on, that he hadn't been irreplaceable, that their marriage had meant so little to her that she could replace him within months. The fact that Elvis had his own affairs, that he'd been pursuing other women since before the divorce was finalized, seemed irrelevant to him. His infidelities didn't count because he was a man, because he was Elvis, because the rules that applied to everyone else didn't apply to him. But Priscilla's relationship with Mike Stone was an unforgivable transgression. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. By the mid-70s, any love that had existed between them had curdled into something poisonous. Elvis began telling people in his inner circle that Priscilla was a manipulator, a user, someone who destroyed him from the inside out. He would spend hours with the Memphis Mafia, rehashing old arguments, building a narrative where he was the victim and she was the architect of his pain. These men, who depended on Elvis for their livelihoods, would listen and agree and reinforce his bitterness. They would tell him he was right to be angry, right to feel betrayed, right to believe that Priscilla had never truly loved him. Nobody challenged this narrative. Nobody suggested that maybe Elvis was being unfair or paranoid, or that both of them had contributed to the marriage's failure. Instead, they fed his resentment, and by doing so, they ensured that when Elvis finally sat down to write his will, Priscilla would be the one he blamed for everything that had gone wrong in his life. When Elvis Presley finally sat down to draft his will in the mid-1970s, he wasn't a man making casual decisions. He was a man at war with his own legacy, acutely aware that he was running out of time, and determined to control what happened to his empire after he was gone. The document that emerged from those sessions wasn't just a legal instrument designed to distribute assets. It was a statement. It was a confession. It was a weapon aimed directly at one person, the woman who'd shared his bed and his life for 14 years. The will itself is surprisingly sparse in its language when it comes to Priscilla. There's no lengthy explanation, no detailed justification for why she's being excluded. Instead, there's only a single paragraph that references certain conduct and material breaches of trust without ever specifying what those breaches actually were. This vagueness is deliberate. Elvis understood that leaving his reasoning explicit would only invite legal challenges and public debate. By keeping it vague, he made it impossible for Priscilla to directly refute his claims. She couldn't defend herself against accusations that were never fully articulated. But the document tells a much clearer story when you examine who benefits and how. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, receives a significant portion of the estate along with ongoing control of Graceland and its operations. Lisa Marie, Elvis's 9-year-old daughter, is the primary beneficiary, with her inheritance placed in a trust that will be managed until she reaches adulthood. The Memphis Mafia members the men who've lived parasitically off Elvis's generosity for years each receive cash bequests and guarantees of continued employment. It's a will designed to reward loyalty and punish what Elvis perceived as betrayal. What makes this arrangement particularly telling is how deliberate every exclusion appears to be. Elvis could have left Priscilla something symbolic, some acknowledgement of their years together or her role in giving him a child. He could have structured it so that Lisa Marie's inheritance wouldn't be diminished by any provision for her mother. But he didn't. Instead, he constructed a will that explicitly denies Priscilla any direct benefit while ensuring that everyone else in his orbit is protected and rewarded. It's the kind of surgical precision that only comes from careful planning, not spontaneous anger. The documents attached to the will, Elvis's personal notes and letters written in his own hand during 1976 and 1977, reveal just how much thought he'd put into this decision. In one handwritten note, Elvis writes about feeling robbed by Priscilla. about her attempts to position herself as my conscience and my keeper, about how she'd used their marriage as a ladder to climb out of obscurity. These aren't the ravings of a man in a drug-induced haze. They're the considered reflections of someone who's processed years of resentment and distilled them into a coherent worldview. What's particularly damning is that Elvis explicitly acknowledges in his notes that he's being vindictive. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't try to justify the exclusion on legal or practical grounds. Instead, he frames it as justice. He writes about how Priscilla received far more than she deserved during their marriage and divorce, how she attempted to manipulate and control him, and how the best gift he can give himself in death is the knowledge that she won't profit from his name or his legacy after he's gone. This is where the will becomes more than just a legal document. It becomes a final act of control, the ultimate statement from a man who'd spent his entire adult life being controlled by managers, promoters, doctors, and yes, by his wife. By disinheriting Priscilla, Elvis was reclaiming agency over the one thing that had always eluded him: his own narrative. He was saying, in the most unambiguous way possible, that his legacy would not be shaped by her, would not benefit her, and would not carry any obligation to her memory. The people closest to Elvis during this period, the Memphis Mafia members, who would later speak on record about his final months, confirmed that the will reflected his actual wishes and mindset. He discussed it with them extensively. He'd expressed his satisfaction with the exclusions. He told them that Priscilla didn't deserve anything, that she'd already taken enough, that disinheriting her was one of the few truly free decisions he'd made in years. He'd even joked darkly about how shocked she'd be when the will was read, how the reality of being cast out would finally show her the consequences of her betrayal. The timing of the will's finalization is also significant. Elvis made his last major amendments to it just months before his death, suggesting that his feelings about Priscilla hadn't softened with time. If anything, they'd intensified. He wasn't a dying man having last-minute regrets about being too harsh. He was a dying man making sure his final statement was ironclad. When Priscilla's attorneys later tried to challenge the will on the grounds that Elvis was mentally incompetent, that he was under the influence of drugs, that the Memphis Mafia had undue influence over his decisions, they ran into an unexpected problem. The very clarity of the will, the very coherence of the reasoning contained within it, worked against them. This didn't look like the work of a man whose judgment was impaired. This looked like the work of someone who'd thought very carefully about what he wanted and had executed those wishes with precision. What the legal system couldn't answer, however, was the fundamental question that haunted everyone who knew the full story. Was Elvis being fair? Was Priscilla truly guilty of the betrayals he'd accused her of? Or had he constructed a narrative that allowed him to justify treating her like an enemy? The will would never provide that answer. It would only provide the evidence of his intent, which was clear and unmistakable. Elvis Presley had looked at the woman he'd once loved and decided she deserved nothing, and he'd made sure that decision would outlive him. Everything that had gone wrong in his life. To understand why Elvis felt so completely betrayed by Priscilla, you have to understand the specific moment when everything changed between them. It wasn't a single incident, but rather a series of actions and revelations that, when taken together, convinced Elvis that the woman he'd married had been playing a role the entire time. And the evidence, documented in letters and testimonies from people who were inside Graceland during those final years, paints a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of a marriage gone wrong. The affair with Mike Stone was only the surface level of what Elvis perceived as Priscilla's betrayal. What truly devastated him was discovering that she'd been actively working against his interests while simultaneously maintaining the facade of a devoted wife. In 1971, when Priscilla had uncovered those financial documents showing Parker and Vernon's questionable dealings, Elvis initially believed she'd done it out of concern for him. But as time passed and he began reflecting on her behavior, he came to a different conclusion. She'd discovered those documents because she was systematically going through his private business affairs, learning his vulnerabilities, understanding exactly where his money was and how it was being managed. Why would she do that? Elvis believed it was because she was building a case against him. She was accumulating knowledge that could be weaponized in a divorce settlement. And when the divorce came exactly as he'd feared, she did precisely what he'd predicted. Her attorneys were ruthless, arguing that she'd sacrificed her own potential career, her own identity, her own future to support his. They positioned her as a victim who'd been used and discarded, and they leveraged that narrative to extract substantial alimony and child support payments from him. But there's another layer to this betrayal that Elvis never publicly discussed, but that haunted him privately. During their marriage, Priscilla had become intimately familiar with his deepest insecurities. She knew about his pharmaceutical dependency. She knew about his sexual dysfunction, which had become increasingly apparent as he aged and his body changed. She knew about his paranoia, his mood swings, his desperate need for validation and control. She'd been there through his most vulnerable moments, witnessing his collapse from the height of his comeback in 1968 to the bloated, sedated figure he became in the mid-70s. And then she used that knowledge. Not explicitly, not in any way that could be traced back to her directly, but through the conversation she had with people in his orbit. She'd mentioned his medication issues to his doctors, subtly suggesting that they were prescribing too much, that Elvis was becoming dependent, that something needed to change. She'd expressed concern to members of his entourage about his behavior, his mood, his ability to perform. These weren't accusations. They were observations framed as worry. But Elvis eventually realized what was happening. Priscilla was positioning herself as the only person who truly understood him, the only one who could see his problems objectively, the only one who cared enough to speak truth to him. From Elvis's perspective, she was doing exactly what she'd learned to do during their marriage, playing a role. But now the role had shifted from devoted wife to concerned ex-wife, and it gave her a kind of power over him that he found intolerable. She had access to his vulnerabilities, and she was using that access to influence the narrative about him, to position herself as the reasonable one, the caring one, the one who wasn't complicit in his self-destruction. The final straw came when Elvis discovered that Priscilla had been communicating directly with his doctors about his medications and medical condition without his knowledge or consent. She'd called Dr. Nick, his personal physician, expressing concern about the prescription cocktails Elvis was taking, suggesting that he should be on different medications, that Elvis was suffering from depression that needed psychiatric intervention. She'd positioned herself as the voice of reason, the only person who truly cared about Elvis's well-being. To Elvis, this was the ultimate violation. She'd taken the intimate knowledge she'd gained during their marriage and weaponized it against him. She was trying to control him through his own doctors, trying to shape the narrative about his mental health, trying to position herself as his savior while simultaneously profiting from the alimony he was forced to pay her. The hypocrisy, as he saw it, was staggering. She was portraying herself as concerned about his health while taking his money. She was acting like she cared about him while actively working to diminish his autonomy and control. What made this even worse, in Elvis's mind, was that it happened after their divorce. During the marriage, you could argue that she had a right to be involved in his medical care, his well-being, his life decisions, but after they'd separated, after he'd paid her settlement, after she'd moved on with Mike Stone, she had no business involving herself in his personal affairs. The fact that she continued to do so suggested that her concern had never been about love. It had always been about control. By the mid-70s, Elvis had constructed a comprehensive narrative in which Priscilla was the villain of his own story. She was the woman who'd married him for his money, who'd betrayed him for another man, who'd tried to control him through his vulnerabilities, who'd positioned herself as his conscience, while simultaneously exploiting him. And most unforgivable of all, she'd done it all while maintaining the facade of loving him, of being the devoted wife who'd sacrificed everything for his career. The will, then, becomes an act of reclamation. By excluding Priscilla entirely, Elvis was saying that he no longer accepted her version of their relationship. He was rejecting her narrative of sacrifice and devotion. He was declaring that she had no claim on his legacy, no right to profit from the name she'd borrowed and the life she'd lived through him. It was his final word in an argument that she'd won on every front during their marriage and divorce. This was the only arena left where he could have absolute control. Lisa Marie would inherit his empire because she was innocent, because she was his blood, because she represented the only truly genuine relationship he'd ever had. Vernon and the Memphis Mafia would be taken care of because they'd been loyal, because they'd supported him, because they'd never pretended to be anything other than what they were. But Priscilla would get nothing, not because Elvis hated her, but because he'd come to believe that she'd never truly been his at all. She'd been an actress playing a role, and the performance had finally ended. If this story about Elvis and Priscilla shocked you, what comes next will devastate you. There's a letter written in Elvis's own handwriting that reveals what he truly believed about her in his final days, and it's darker than anything you've heard. Subscribe now, hit that bell, and don't miss the next video. The truth is waiting.
Really wanted to go. It was the second saddest day of my life, other than, losing Elvis.
On March 14th, 2023, two construction workers renovating Graceland's private bathroom made a discovery that would shatter nearly 5 decades of carefully maintained silence. They were updating plumbing behind the bathroom walls when their sledgehammer broke through what they thought was solid drywall and instead revealed a hidden compartment. Inside that compartment, sealed in a manila envelope and protected by plastic wrapping, was a 4-page handwritten letter that Elvis Presley never intended anyone to find. The envelope was addressed in Elvis's distinctive handwriting to Scylla, his pet name, for Priscilla, and dated July 28, 1977, 19 days before the world lost the king of rock and roll forever. The workers who found the letter had no idea what they were holding. They assumed it was some kind of vintage memorabilia that had been stored and forgotten during one of Graceland's many renovations over the decades. But when the estate manager examined the envelope and recognized the handwriting, everything stopped. The renovation was immediately halted. The workers were asked to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements, and within hours, a team of forensic document analysts was flying to Memphis to determine whether this letter was authentic or the most elaborate hoax in Elvis Presley history. The authentication process that followed was more thorough than anything typically applied to historical documents. Handwriting analysts compared the letter's script to authenticated Elvis samples spanning his entire adult life. The formation of his letters, the pressure patterns of his pen strokes, the distinctive way he wrote certain words when he was emotionally agitated, every microscopic detail was scrutinized and cross-referenced. Paper specialists analyzed the stationery itself, confirming it matched Elvis's personal letterhead from the 1970s, complete with the Graceland address embossed at the top. Ink composition analysis revealed blue ballpoint ink consistent with pens available in 1977, with aging patterns that matched the claimed date perfectly. But the most compelling piece of authentication came from Priscilla herself. When shown photographs of the letter during the verification process, she immediately recognized not just Elvis's handwriting, but the specific pen he had used. She identified it as a blue ballpoint pen she had given him as a gift years earlier, one with a distinctive silver band around the middle that he had favored for personal correspondence. The pressure patterns on the paper, where Elvis had pressed so hard that the ink almost tore through, matched exactly how he wrote when he was upset or frightened. This wasn't the careful, controlled handwriting of someone composing a casual note. This was the desperate scrawl of a man trying to communicate something urgent while fighting against time. Every expert who examined the letter reached the same conclusion: it was undeniably authentic. Which meant that 19 days before his death, Elvis Presley had written a letter to his former wife that he never sent, hidden it in a location that suggested he was terrified of being discovered, and died before he could retrieve it. But this wasn't a sentimental goodbye or a nostalgic reflection on their relationship. What forensic analysts found when they examined the content made them understand immediately why Elvis had hidden it so carefully, and why the Presley estate moved within hours to suppress it completely. The moment the letter's authenticity was confirmed, a legal battle erupted that revealed just how devastating its contents actually were. The Presley estate filed emergency motions claiming attorney-client privilege, arguing that the letter contained sensitive family information that was never meant for public consumption. They invoked privacy rights, intellectual property protections, and even attempted to claim that the letter was part of sealed estate documentation. But their most telling argument was their insistence that the letter was private family correspondence that would damage Elvis's reputation if released in argument that only makes sense if the letter contains information that contradicts the official story of Elvis's final weeks. Legal experts following the case noted that the estate's response was unprecedented in its speed and comprehensive scope. They weren't just trying to keep the letter private, they were trying to prevent anyone from even discussing its existence. Cease and desist letters were sent to the authentication experts who had examined it. Non-disclosure agreements were demanded from everyone who had seen it. The estate's legal team filed motions asking the court to seal all documentation related to the letter's discovery and authentication. This wasn't standard privacy protection. This was evidence suppression on a scale that suggested the letter's contents posed existential threat to decades of carefully maintained narrative. Because this letter wasn't what anyone expected to find. Elvis hadn't written to Priscilla to express love, regret, or nostalgia about their relationship. He hadn't written to share memories or seek closure for their divorce. Instead, Elvis had written to reveal something that he believed would cost him his life if the wrong people discovered it. The letter contained detailed accusations against named individuals in his inner circle, specific descriptions of financial arrangements he had uncovered, and most shockingly, a timeline for staging his own death that he was asking Priscilla to help him execute. This wasn't a suicide note, it was an escape plan. The location where the letter was discovered told its own story. Elvis had sealed it behind a false panel in his private bathroom, the one place in Graceland where he could be certain of privacy. He had wrapped it in plastic and hidden it in a way that suggested he planned to retrieve it later, but also in a way that would preserve it if something happened to him first. The hiding place wasn't random or convenient. It was strategic, chosen by someone who understood that his private communications were being monitored and that his movements were being watched. When the construction workers broke through that wall on March 14, 2023, they didn't just find a letter. They found evidence that Elvis Presley's death may not have been the tragic accident the world has believed for 46 years. Because the very first line Elvis wrote to Priscilla wasn't an expression of love or a request for reconciliation. It was a cry for help that arrived 46 years too late. Priscilla, they're going to kill me, and I need your help to die first. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. The words that Elvis wrote to Priscilla in those 4 pages weren't the rambling thoughts of a man losing touch with reality. They were the methodical, detailed observations of someone who had discovered something terrifying and was documenting it with the precision of a man who understood his life depended on getting the facts exactly right. Page 1 began with that devastating opening line to Priscilla. But what followed was even more shocking. Elvis wrote, that he had spent weeks secretly investigating his own life, going through documents and contracts when his handlers thought he was sleeping, and what he found had changed everything he thought he understood about the people controlling his world. Elvis told Priscilla that his discovery began when he overheard a conversation between his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, and Dr. George Nicopolis that wasn't meant for his ears. He wrote that he had been pretending to sleep in his bedroom when the two men entered to discuss what they called the Elvis situation. But they weren't talking about his health or his career. They were talking about financial arrangements that would activate upon his death. Elvis described lying perfectly still while the two men discussed insurance policies, estate planning documents, and management contracts that paid significantly higher percentages to his handlers if he died than if he continued living. In his letter, Elvis wrote, "I found the papers, Scylla, the insurance policies, the estate planning documents, the contracts that pay them more when I'm dead than they make keeping me alive. They've been planning this longer than I've been sick." What Elvis had discovered about his medical care was even more devastating. He wrote that Dr. Nicopolis wasn't just over-prescribing medication, he was deliberately combining prescriptions in ways designed to create specific psychological and physical effects. Elvis described finding medical notes in Dr. Nick's handwriting that didn't focus on treating his conditions, but on managing patient compliance and maintaining controlled dependency. The medication combinations weren't designed to help Elvis feel better. They were designed to keep him cognitively impaired enough that he couldn't make independent decisions about his own life. Elvis wrote to Priscilla, "Dr. Nick isn't trying to cure me. He's trying to control me. The pills aren't medicine, they're chemical handcuffs. And when I tried to cut back, they told me I was having withdrawal hallucinations." The letter revealed that Elvis had been systematically isolated from anyone who might question his treatment or advocate for his independence. He wrote that his handlers had created what they called protective protocols that prevented him from meeting with family members, friends, or business associates without supervision. Elvis described how phone calls were monitored, mail was screened, and visitors were briefed before they saw him about what topics were too stressful for him to discuss. Anyone who expressed concern about his condition was told he was having paranoid episodes and that contradicting his medical team could trigger dangerous psychological reactions. Elvis wrote, "They won't let me see anyone alone anymore. They say it's for my privacy, but I know it's because they're afraid I'll tell someone what's really happening to me." But the most shocking revelation in Elvis's letter was his detailed plan to escape by staging his own death. He had been secretly reducing his medication intake for weeks, enduring withdrawal symptoms in private to clear his head enough to think and plan. He had identified accounts that his handlers didn't know about, small amounts of money he could access independently. Most importantly, he had contacted someone outside his inner circle, someone he didn't name in the letter, who was willing to help him disappear permanently. Elvis wrote that he had studied how other people had successfully faked their deaths, and he believed he could make it convincing enough that his handlers would stop looking for him. The plan was elaborate and specific. He would stage a medical emergency at Graceland, be declared dead by a complicit medical professional, and then be secretly transported to a location where he could live anonymously until the people trying to control him moved on to other opportunities. Elvis gave Priscilla exact instructions for her role in this plan. She was to publicly grieve appropriately, but privately know that he was alive and safe. He would contact her through predetermined signals once he was established in his new location. Most importantly, she was to never attempt to find him or verify his survival, because any investigation on her part could expose the deception and put both their lives at risk. Elvis wrote, "I need you to arrange everything. Make it look real enough that they stop looking for me. I can't keep being Elvis Presley, it's going to kill me if I stay." The timeline Elvis outlined in his letter was chillingly precise. He planned to execute his fake death in mid-August 1977, specifically during a period when his normal routines would make a medical emergency seem plausible. The most devastating aspect of Elvis's hidden letter isn't what he wrote to Priscilla, it's the fact that she never received it. When forensic analysts examined the envelope's condition and the circumstances of its discovery, they uncovered evidence that Elvis never had the opportunity to send the letter he had risked everything to write. The false panel where it was hidden showed signs of hasty construction, suggesting Elvis had sealed the letter behind the wall with the intention of retrieving it later. But the timing of when that panel was created, cross-referenced with Elvis's death just 19 days later, reveals something chilling. Elvis ran out of time to execute the very escape plan he was asking Priscilla to help him accomplish. What makes this revelation particularly significant is what handwriting experts discovered when they examined the envelope itself. Elvis had written 2 different addresses on it, something that only becomes apparent under forensic analysis using specialized lighting. The first address, written in his normal script, was Priscilla's home in California. But underneath, partially erased and written in the pressed, urgent handwriting that appears throughout the letter, was a Memphis address. This suggests Elvis had changed his plan for delivering the letter, deciding against mailing it directly to Priscilla and instead planning to hand-deliver it to a local intermediary who could get it to her safely. The fact that he felt the need to route his communication through a third party reveals the extent to which Elvis believed his direct contact with the outside world was being controlled and monitored. That belief wasn't paranoid delusion. Throughout the letter, Elvis made references that prove he understood his communications were being intercepted. He wrote to Priscilla about previous attempts to contact her that had been blocked, describing phone calls that had been disconnected and messages that had never reached their intended destination. In one particularly haunting passage, Elvis wrote, "I can't call you directly anymore. They listen to everything. I can't write letters because they go through my mail. I can't even trust the people who drive me places because they report back to the Colonel and Dr. Nick about everywhere I go and everyone I try to see." This wasn't the rambling of someone experiencing drug-induced paranoia. This was the systematic documentation of a surveillance network that had isolated Elvis completely from anyone who might help him break free from the control his handlers had established. Elvis's letter revealed that he had made multiple attempts to reach Priscilla through intermediaries in the weeks leading up to his death, but each attempt had been discovered and blocked. He described trying to get messages to her through Jerry Schilling, one of his oldest friends, only to discover that Jerry had been told Elvis was experiencing paranoid episodes and that any unusual requests should be reported immediately to Elvis's medical team. He wrote about attempting to contact Billy Smith, his cousin, asking him to call Priscilla with a coded message about Elvis's condition. But that attempt was also intercepted, and Billy was subsequently told that Elvis's family was concerned about his mental state and that anyone receiving strange communications from him should contact Dr. Nikopoulos immediately rather than follow through on Elvis's requests. The systematic nature of these blocked communications reveals something that goes far beyond simple medical oversight or family concern. Elvis's handlers had created a comprehensive isolation protocol that prevented him from establishing contact with anyone outside their controlled circle. Every potential ally, every possible escape route, every person who might question what was happening to Elvis had been neutralized through a combination of misinformation, legal threats, and financial incentives. Elvis had become a prisoner in his own life, surrounded by people who claimed to be protecting him while actually preventing him from seeking protection anywhere else. When Priscilla was shown the authenticated letter in 2023, her reaction provided crucial corroboration for Elvis's claims about blocked communications. She confirmed that in the weeks before Elvis's death, she had received a series of strange phone calls to her California home. The calls would come at unusual hours early morning or very late at night, and when she answered, there would be brief periods of silence followed by someone who sounded like Elvis saying cryptic phrases before the line would go dead. She had assumed these were prank calls from Elvis impersonators, especially since Elvis's voice sounded strained and unlike his normal speaking patterns. But reading his letter, she realized those calls had been Elvis trying to communicate with her in ways that wouldn't trigger the monitoring system he described. Priscilla also confirmed something that investigators found particularly significant. During the same period when Elvis was trying to reach her, she had attempted to call Graceland several times to speak with him directly. Each time she was told that Elvis was either sleeping, in meetings, or too ill to take phone calls. The person who took these messages assured her that Elvis would be told she had called and that he would return her calls when he felt better. Elvis never called back. But according to his letter, he never received those messages. The communication blackout between Elvis and Priscilla wasn't accidental, it was being actively maintained by people who had reasons for keeping them apart. The timeline revealed in Elvis's letter shows that his failed escape plan wasn't just about avoiding the people who were controlling him, it was about exposing them. Elvis had written to Priscilla that he planned to fake his death in mid-August 1977, disappear for a period of time, and then surface publicly with evidence of the financial and medical manipulation he had discovered. He believed that faking his death would allow him to escape the legal agreements that kept him trapped, while also providing cover for gathering the proof he needed to expose the conspiracy against him. But Elvis's death occurred exactly when his letter said he planned to stage his fake death. Which means either his escape plan was tragically successful in ways he never intended, or the people he was trying to escape discovered his plan and decided that a real death would serve their interests better than a fake one. The most chilling evidence of this possibility lies in what happened to the Memphis address Elvis had written on the envelope. When investigators attempted to trace that address, they discovered it belonged to someone who had died in a car accident just 3 days before Elvis's death. Whether that timing was coincidental or calculated remains unclear, but it meant that Elvis's backup plan for getting his letter to Priscilla had been eliminated before he could execute it. He died with his cry for help sealed behind a bathroom wall, his escape route blocked, and his final communication to the person he trusted most buried where no one would find it for 46 years. Elvis's letter was never sent because Elvis never had the chance to send it, and that fact transforms his death from a tragic ending into something far more sinister: the successful completion of a plan that Elvis had discovered but couldn't escape in time. Elvis's hidden letter doesn't just rewrite the story of his final weeks, it fundamentally transforms our understanding of his death from tragic accident to potential homicide. When you examine the timeline Elvis laid out in his letter against what actually happened on August 16, 1977, the coincidences become too precise to dismiss as mere chance. Elvis wrote that he planned to stage his death in mid-August, specifically during a period when his handlers would be expecting him to be in poor health due to his medication schedule. He died on August 16, 1977, exactly when his letter said he intended to fake his death, under circumstances that perfectly matched the scenario he had been planning to orchestrate. The question that haunts every page of his letter is whether Elvis succeeded in his plan to disappear, or whether someone else discovered that plan and decided to make it permanent in ways that served their interests rather than his. The financial motive for Elvis's murder becomes undeniable when you examine the documents he referenced in his letter. Elvis wrote about finding insurance policies and estate planning agreements that made his death enormously profitable for the people managing his affairs. These weren't standard entertainment industry contracts, they were sophisticated financial instruments that created massive payouts upon Elvis's death while providing relatively modest, ongoing compensation during his lifetime. Elvis had inadvertently discovered that Colonel Parker, Dr. Nicopolis, and several other members of his inner circle had structured their relationships with him in ways that made his death worth more to them than his continued living. The letter suggests Elvis planned to expose these arrangements as part of his escape plan, giving his handlers powerful financial incentive to prevent that exposure permanently. But the most damning evidence in Elvis's letter relates to his medical treatment. Elvis described discovering that his prescription medications were being deliberately combined in ways designed not to treat his legitimate medical conditions, but to create and maintain cognitive impairment. He wrote about attempting to reduce his medication intake to clear his head for his escape, only to find that his handlers responded by increasing his dosages and introducing new pharmaceutical combinations that left him more dependent and less capable of independent decision-making. The massive concentrations of prescription drugs found in Elvis's system at the time of his death weren't evidence of Elvis's inability to control his drug intake, they were evidence of other people controlling his drug intake to serve their own purposes. This medical manipulation provides new context for understanding Elvis's autopsy findings that have puzzled independent analysts for decades. The pharmaceutical combinations found in his system were so extreme that they should have killed him hours before he was officially discovered dead. But if Elvis was attempting to reduce his medication to execute his escape plan, and if his handlers discovered this and responded by administering massive emergency doses to prevent his escape, then the timeline of his death suddenly makes perfect sense. Elvis may have died not from accidental overdose, but from deliberate pharmaceutical assassination designed to stop his escape plan before it could be completed. The pattern Elvis documented in his letter reveals institutional practices that continue to operate in the entertainment industry today. The systematic isolation from family and friends, the control over all communication, the creation of financial dependency, the use of medical treatment as a mechanism for behavioral control. These techniques didn't disappear when Elvis died. They were refined, legalized, and institutionalized as standard practices for managing high-value celebrities who generate enormous revenue for the people around them. Elvis's letter provides historical documentation of how these systems function when they escalate to the point where the celebrity becomes more valuable dead than alive. Recent celebrity deaths involving young performers who had expressed concerns about their handlers, their medications, and their loss of personal autonomy echo the patterns Elvis described with terrifying precision. Whitney Houston, Michael Jackson, Prince all died under circumstances involving prescription drug combinations administered by medical professionals who had financial relationships with the celebrities' management teams. All had expressed concerns in their final months about losing control over their own lives and medical care. All had begun attempting to assert independence from handlers who had become financially dependent on maintaining control over them. And all died before they could successfully escape the systems that were extracting value from their fame while destroying their capacity to protect themselves. The Presley estate's ongoing legal efforts to suppress Elvis's letter reveal the scope of institutional investment in maintaining the official story. The resources being spent to prevent public access to Elvis's own written words about his final weeks aren't just about protecting privacy there, about protecting decades of carefully constructed narrative designed to blame Elvis for his own destruction while absolving the people who profited from that destruction. The estate's legal strategy treats Elvis's letter not as historical evidence to be preserved, but as a threat to be contained. Which raises the question, what are they protecting? And why does Elvis's own testimony about his final weeks require such aggressive suppression? For the millions of people who have spent 46 years believing that Elvis died because he couldn't overcome his personal demons, this letter requires a fundamental moral reckoning. Elvis didn't die because he was too weak to handle fame or too addicted to control his behavior. He died because the machinery of fame had evolved into a system of exploitation so sophisticated that escape required faking death, and even that desperate measure was prevented by people who found murder more convenient than freedom. The comfortable narrative that blamed Elvis for his own destruction protected the reputation of his handlers while ensuring that the systems that killed him could continue operating without scrutiny. Elvis's letter forces us to confront what we really mean when we talk about protecting someone's legacy. The official story protects the people who destroyed Elvis by framing his death as personal failure rather than institutional homicide. But Elvis's own words suggest that protecting his real legacy requires confronting the truth about who killed him and why they did it. The letter asks whether we loved Elvis enough to handle the truth about how celebrity exploitation killed him, or whether we preferred the lie that he killed himself because it was easier than confronting the systems that made his murder profitable. The letter Elvis never intended anyone to find reveals that his death wasn't a conclusion, it was an accusation. An accusation that has waited 46 years to be heard, sealed behind a bathroom wall in the house where he died. Written in desperate handwriting by a man who knew he was running out of time to save himself. Elvis's final written words weren't a goodbye, they were evidence. Evidence that the king of rock and roll was murdered by the people he trusted most, for reasons that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with money. What makes this revelation particularly devastating is its implication for every other celebrity death that has followed the same pattern. If Elvis Presley could be systematically isolated, medically controlled, and ultimately killed by his own handlers without any institutional accountability, then the entertainment industry operates as a legalized assassination network, where fame becomes a death sentence and the people claiming to protect celebrities are actually positioning themselves to profit from their deaths. Elvis's hidden letter transforms his death from personal tragedy into institutional crime. And the fact that it took 46 years for this evidence to surface reveals how successfully those institutions have operated to suppress the truth about what they do to the people who make them rich. Elvis's final message to Priscilla wasn't just a cry for help, it was a witness statement. And now, finally, someone is listening to what the witness had to say. If Elvis's hidden letter to Priscilla has shattered everything you thought you knew about his death good, some truths are worth the shattering. Subscribe now for more suppressed celebrity revelations the industry doesn't want exposed. Hit the bell, share your thoughts below, and tell someone who deserves to know this story.
I got a call. I was going to an appointment and meeting my sister, and I saw my sister, and she said, "You have to go home." I have chills even talking about it. Instantly, I knew something was wrong.
There's a collection of letters sitting in a private archive that nobody wanted you to know about. Letters written by Elvis Presley between 1972 and 1977, addressed to the few people he trusted completely. His spiritual advisor, Larry Geller, his personal physician, Dr. Nick, and most importantly, his father, Vernon. These weren't love letters or casual correspondence. They were something far more disturbing. They were documentation. Meticulous, heartbreaking documentation of lies that Elvis had caught Priscilla Presley telling, patterns of deception he was tracking in real time, and his growing, devastating realization that the woman he'd married might have been playing a calculated role from the very beginning. For decades, Priscilla has controlled the narrative about their relationship. She's painted herself as the young bride who tried to make it work with a difficult, troubled man. She's positioned herself as the one who left reluctantly, who moved on with dignity, who spent the rest of her life honoring his memory. And she's painted Elvis as naive, as someone who didn't understand what was happening around him, as a man too consumed by fame and addiction to see reality clearly. But these letters tell a completely different story. They reveal an Elvis who was watching, documenting, and understanding far more than anyone gave him credit for. The earliest letter in the collection is dated August 1972, written to Larry Geller during a period when Elvis and Priscilla were still married but clearly fracturing. In it, Elvis describes catching Priscilla in a lie about where she'd been the previous afternoon. She told him she was taking Lisa Marie to a doctor's appointment, but Elvis had called the doctor's office and learned no appointment had been scheduled. When he confronted her, she changed her story, claimed she'd gotten confused about the date, then became defensive and accused him of not trusting her. Elvis wrote to Larry that it was the defensiveness that bothered him most, the way she turned his legitimate question into an attack on her character. The way she made him feel guilty for noticing that her story didn't add up. What makes these letters so powerful is that they're not the ravings of a paranoid man. They're calm, detailed observations from someone who's starting to recognize a pattern. Elvis documented specific instances where Priscilla's stories contradicted themselves. Times when she said she was with one friend, but someone else mentioned seeing her somewhere completely different. Expenses she claimed were for household needs that never seemed to result in anything being purchased. Conversations where she talked about future plans that didn't include him, then acted surprised when he pointed out the exclusion. In a letter to Vernon from early 1973, just before the divorce was finalized, Elvis wrote something that's almost painful to read now. He described feeling like he wasn't a husband anymore, wasn't even really a person to Priscilla. He said he felt like a bank account with a pulse, like someone whose only value was in what he could provide financially. He wrote about realizing that Priscilla calculated every interaction with an eye toward her future security, that she'd stopped pretending to care about him as a person and was now just managing him as an asset. The lies weren't just about infidelity, though that was part of it. Elvis documented lies about money, about what things cost and where money was going. He caught her in lies about conversations she claimed to have had with Lisa Marie's teachers, conversations that never actually happened. He noticed that she lied reflexively, even about small things that didn't matter, as if truth and fiction were equally useful tools to be deployed depending on which served her better in the moment. What's most heartbreaking is watching Elvis's realization unfold across these letters. In the early ones, he's confused, trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, wondering if he's being too suspicious. By the mid-70s, he's resigned, accepting that this is who she is and always has been. And in the final letters, there's something close to clarity. He's no longer hurt by the lies because he's stopped expecting truth. He's just documenting them, preserving evidence, preparing for something he seems to know is coming. But it's the letter dated February 1977 that changes everything. Written just 6 months before his death, addressed to his father Vernon, it's the most explicit warning Elvis ever put in writing. He tells Vernon that when he's gone, Priscilla will try to take control of everything. He describes exactly what she'll do, how she'll position herself as the grieving widow, how she'll use Lisa Marie as justification for inserting herself into estate decisions, how she'll slowly but systematically build an empire on his name while pushing his actual daughter aside. Elvis was specific. He told Vernon not to let Priscilla make decisions about Graceland, about his catalog, about his image. He said she'd already shown him who she was, that her actions during their marriage and divorce had revealed someone who saw him as a commodity to be managed and monetized. He begged Vernon to protect Lisa Marie's inheritance from Priscilla's control. And then Elvis wrote something that still echoes decades later. He said that Priscilla had been lying to him from the beginning, that he'd finally accepted he never really knew who she was, and that giving her power over his legacy after his death would be the ultimate betrayal of everything he'd worked for. Vernon received that letter in March of 1977. 5 months later, Elvis was dead. And everything Elvis predicted in that letter came true. The private investigator report started arriving in late 1971. Elvis had hired a firm out of Los Angeles, not the kind of investigators who worked divorce cases for tabloid fodder, but serious professionals who knew how to be invisible. He didn't tell anyone he was doing it. Not his father, not his closest friends, not even Larry Geller. He just needed to know if what he suspected about Priscilla was real or if his own paranoia was creating monsters that didn't exist. What came back in those manila envelopes over the next 18 months destroyed any hope he had that he was wrong. The affair with Mike Stone was real, but it was almost the least interesting thing the investigators documented. What they brought back was evidence of a secret life that Priscilla had been constructing while still playing the role of devoted wife at Graceland. multiple relationships, some romantic and some purely transactional, business meetings that she'd never mentioned to Elvis, conversations with lawyers and financial advisors about scenarios that hadn't happened yet. The investigators recorded her talking about life after Elvis, not in the wistful way someone talks about divorce, but in the calculated way someone discusses a business transition they're actively planning. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now, let's continue. One report from March of 1972 detailed a lunch meeting Priscilla had with an entertainment lawyer in Beverly Hills. The investigator had managed to position himself close enough to hear portions of the conversation. Priscilla was asking questions about community property law in California, about how assets would be divided in a divorce, about what she'd be entitled to based on the years she'd been married. This was months before she moved out, months before she officially met Mike Stone at her karate class. She was already building her exit strategy, already calculating what she could extract, already preparing for a future that didn't include being Mrs. Elvis Presley. But it was the conversations about Elvis's name and image that truly shocked him when he read the reports. The investigators documented Priscilla having discussions with business associates about licensing opportunities, about merchandising potential, about what could be done with the Elvis brand. She was talking about these things in 1972, while Elvis was still very much alive and completely unaware that his wife was discussing his commercial value like he was already a legacy to be managed rather than a living person she was married to. Elvis kept every single report. He filed them carefully, adding his own notes in the margins. Next to one passage where Priscilla was recorded telling a friend that she was just biding her time until the right moment, Elvis wrote one word in blue ink, calculating. Next to another section where she discussed what Elvis's death would mean for the value of his estate, he wrote a question mark followed by the words, already planning? The reports paint a picture of a woman who wasn't just falling out of love or seeking fulfillment elsewhere. They show someone actively constructing an alternative future while maintaining the facade of the present. The lies about Lisa Marie cut the deepest. Priscilla's public narrative has always been that she fought for custody because she wanted stability for their daughter, because she believed Elvis's lifestyle was too chaotic for a child. But Elvis's documentation tells a different story entirely. He kept records of every conversation where Priscilla used Lisa Marie as leverage, every threat to limit his access unless he agreed to more favorable financial terms, every instance where their daughter became a bargaining chip in negotiations that had nothing to do with her well-being. In one particularly damning phone conversation that Elvis recorded in mid-1973, Priscilla explicitly told him that his visitation schedule with Lisa Marie would depend on how reasonable he was being about the settlement. She said it casually, almost as if she didn't realize she was admitting to using their 5-year-old daughter as a tool for financial extraction. Elvis played that tape for his bodyguard Red West, and Red later recalled that Elvis sat in silence for a long time after it ended, just staring at the recorder like he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. Red remembered Elvis saying something that night that would haunt him for years afterward. Elvis told him that sometimes he felt like Priscilla was just waiting for him to die so she could finally do what she'd been planning all along. Red had laughed it off at the time, told Elvis he was being paranoid, suggested the pills were making him see conspiracies that weren't there. But Elvis wasn't laughing. He pulled out one of the investigator reports and showed Red the documented evidence of Priscilla's meetings, her conversations, her calculations. He told Red that she'd been spending his money in her head for years, that she'd been building a post-Elvis empire while he was still alive to see it happening. What made it unbearable for Elvis wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that he'd never really known her. The investigators had documented a version of Priscilla that was completely different from the woman she presented at Graceland. When she was with Elvis, she played the role of wounded wife, of someone trying to hold together a difficult marriage. But when she thought no one was watching, when she was with her lawyers and advisors and business contacts, she was someone else entirely. Someone calculating and strategic and utterly focused on securing her financial future, regardless of what it cost the man she'd promised to love and honor. Elvis kept gathering evidence right up until his death. He documented every lie, every contradiction, every moment when Priscilla's mask slipped. He was building a case, though he wasn't entirely sure what he'd do with it. Maybe he thought he'd use it to protect Lisa Marie someday. Maybe he just needed proof that he wasn't crazy for seeing what everyone else seemed to miss. Or maybe he knew that after he was gone, someone would need this evidence to understand what had really happened. By 1975, Elvis had started asking questions that made his business managers visibly uncomfortable. Questions about where his money was actually going, about why he seemed to be making more than ever, but had less liquidity than he'd had a decade earlier. Questions about who was approving certain expenses and why he was finding out about financial decisions after they'd already been made. And the more he dug, the more he discovered that Priscilla, despite being divorced from him since 1973, had maintained a shocking degree of influence over decisions about his financial future. The estate planning documents he found in his lawyer's office were dated 1974, a full year after their divorce was finalized. Elvis hadn't authorized them. He hadn't even been consulted about them. Yet there they were, legal documents discussing inheritance scenarios, outlining what would happen to his wealth if he died, detailing how his assets would be distributed. And Priscilla's name appeared throughout them, not as an ex-wife receiving limited support, but as someone positioned to have significant control over the estate's administration. When Elvis confronted his attorney about these documents, the lawyer admitted that Priscilla had been scheduling meetings to discuss these scenarios. She'd presented herself as someone acting in Lisa Marie's best interests, as a concerned mother ensuring her daughter's inheritance would be properly managed. But Elvis saw through it immediately. Lisa Marie was 6 years old. She didn't need estate planning discussions. This was Priscilla positioning herself for control, using their daughter as justification for inserting herself into financial decisions that should have had nothing to do with her. What Elvis discovered next was even more disturbing. Going through old expense reports and financial records, he found discrepancies that his accountants had either missed or chosen to ignore. Invoices for Lisa Marie's care that seemed inflated beyond any reasonable amount, a piano teacher charging $500 an hour, private tutoring that supposedly cost more per month than most people's annual salary, medical expenses for routine checkups that looked more like surgical procedures. When Elvis started calling these providers directly, some of them had no record of charging anything close to those amounts. The money was being paid out based on Priscilla's submitted expenses, but it wasn't all going where it was supposed to go. His personal attorney later estimated that over the course of just 2 years, somewhere between $70,000 and $90,000 had been siphoned off through these inflated expense claims. In 1970s money, that was substantial. And when Elvis tried to address it, Priscilla became defensive and accusatory, claiming he was trying to shortchange his own daughter, turning his legitimate questions about financial irregularities into attacks on his character as a father. But it was what Elvis found in a storage box at Graceland that truly shattered whatever remained of his illusions about their relationship. Letters between Priscilla and her parents from the early 1960s, from the time when she was still living in Germany and he was finishing his military service. Letters that discussed him not as a romantic interest or a love match, but as an opportunity. Her father wrote about the importance of securing their family's financial future. Her mother offered advice about maintaining his interest, about positioning herself correctly, about making sure that if this relationship was going to continue, It needed to result in marriage and legal ties that would provide security. Reading those letters was like watching the foundation of his entire marriage crack apart. Elvis had believed their love story was genuine, that despite the age difference and the unusual circumstances, they'd found something real. But these letters suggested something far more calculated had been happening from the very beginning. Priscilla hadn't fallen for him. She'd been guided into a strategic position by parents who saw what he represented financially and wanted to secure a piece of it for their daughter. In response to these discoveries, Elvis began the painful process of trying to protect what was left of his legacy. He changed his will in late 1975, then again in early 76, then twice more in 77. Each version attempted to limit Priscilla's control while ensuring Lisa Marie would inherit everything. Each version tried to create structures that would keep Priscilla's hands off his estate's decision-making while still providing reasonable support. But the legal language was complex, the revisions took time, and Elvis's lawyers kept advising caution and further review. One of those lawyers, who spoke anonymously decades later, recalled a conversation from June of 1977 that still haunted him. Elvis had come to his office furious about another discovery, another lie, another piece of evidence that Priscilla had been manipulating situations behind his back. The lawyer tried to calm him down, suggested they'd address it in the next will revision, but Elvis cut him off and said something the lawyer never forgot. He said he'd made the biggest mistake of his life trusting Priscilla. He said she'd been lying to him from day one, and he'd been too young and too stupid to see it. He said he was trying to fix it now, trying to protect Lisa Marie from her mother's greed, trying to make sure that when he was gone, Priscilla wouldn't be able to do to his daughter what she'd done to him. The final version of the will, the one that would have severely limited Priscilla's role and created independent oversight of the estate, was still in draft form when Elvis died on August 16, 1977. He'd been reviewing it, making notes, preparing to sign. But he ran out of time, and that failure to execute that final document opened the door for exactly what Elvis had been trying to prevent. Elvis didn't just discover Priscilla's lies and document them in private. He tried to warn everyone who would listen. He sat his father, Vernon, down multiple times and explicitly told him not to let Priscilla control his estate after he was gone. He pulled his personal attorney aside and said the words directly: keep her away from the decision-making, limit her to financial support only, don't let her position herself as the guardian of my legacy. He told friends in the Memphis Mafia to watch her carefully, to remember what he was saying, to make sure that when he was gone, Lisa Marie's inheritance didn't get filtered through Priscilla's control. He even made audio recordings, sitting alone in his bedroom at Grassland, speaking his concerns into a tape recorder like a man leaving evidence for a trial he knew he wouldn't be alive to attend. But after Elvis died on August 16, 1977, every single one of those warnings was dismissed. Family members who'd heard Elvis express concerns about Priscilla chalked it up to bitterness from the divorce, to the anger of a man who'd been left. Lawyers who'd heard him outline his fears treated them as the paranoid ramblings of someone whose judgment was compromised by prescription medications. Business associates who'd witnessed his explicit instructions assumed it was just Elvis being dramatic, being emotional, saying things in the heat of the moment that he didn't really mean. Nobody took him seriously, and that catastrophic failure of belief allowed Priscilla to do exactly what Elvis had predicted she would do. What Elvis actually wanted for his legacy was crystal clear to everyone who'd listened to him in those final years. He wanted Lisa Marie to inherit everything: the music catalog, the royalties, Graceland, his image rights, every asset that bore his name. He wanted Vernon to serve as executor until Lisa Marie came of age, managing the estate with the sole purpose of preserving it for his daughter. And after Vernon's death, Elvis wanted independent financial managers with no personal connection to Priscilla. professionals whose only obligation was to Lisa Marie's interests, not to anyone else's agenda. Elvis was explicit about Priscilla's role in this future. She should receive a modest annual allowance in recognition of being Lisa Marie's mother, enough to live comfortably but not enough to build an empire. She should have no control over his estate, no authority over his image, no decision-making power over how his legacy would be managed and monetized. He'd seen what she did when she had access to money and influence. He'd documented her lies and her calculations, and he'd made it absolutely clear to multiple people that giving her control over anything related to his legacy would be a betrayal of everything he'd worked for. But within months of his death, while Vernon was still drowning in grief and barely functional, Priscilla began her systematic takeover. She positioned herself as the grieving widow, the woman who'd loved Elvis despite their divorce, the mother who needed to protect their daughter's inheritance. She exploited the chaos of those early months, the confusion about what Elvis had wanted, the absence of a finalized will that reflected his actual wishes. She inserted herself into conversations about Graceland's future, about the estate's management, about decisions that Elvis had explicitly tried to exclude her from making. Vernon was too broken to fight her. Elvis's friends were too scattered and too legally powerless to intervene. The attorneys were more concerned with avoiding probate complications than honoring a dead man's verbal instructions. And Priscilla, who'd spent years watching and learning and calculating, knew exactly which levers to pull and which people to convince. By the time anyone realized what was happening, she'd secured positions of authority that Elvis had spent his final years trying to prevent her from obtaining. The people who heard Elvis's warnings firsthand have carried that knowledge like a wound for decades. Red West, who heard Elvis predict exactly what Priscilla would do, admitted years later that dismissing those warnings was one of his greatest regrets. He said he'd thought Elvis was being paranoid, that the pills were distorting his perception, that he was seeing conspiracies where there were just normal divorce complications. But watching Priscilla operate after Elvis's death, watching her build an empire on his name while sidelining Lisa Marie from meaningful control, Red realized that Elvis had been right about everything. Joe Esposito, another member of the Memphis Mafia, finally spoke publicly before his death about a conversation he'd had with Elvis in July of 1977. Elvis had told him that Priscilla was going to rewrite history, that she'd spend the rest of her life controlling the narrative about their relationship and his legacy, that she'd make herself the hero and make him look like the fool who couldn't see what she was doing. Joe had laughed it off at the time. Decades later, he wasn't laughing. He was admitting that everything Elvis predicted had come to pass, and the people who should have protected his wishes had failed him completely. But it's the audio recording that surfaced from a private collection that delivers the final, devastating blow. Made by Elvis in July of 1977, less than a month before his death, it captures him alone, speaking with a clarity that contradicts any suggestion he was too impaired to understand what he was saying. His voice is tired but firm, sad but certain, and what he says is a prophecy that came true in every detail. He talks about Priscilla rewriting everything after he's gone, about her positioning herself as the guardian of his legacy while pushing his daughter aside. He says he's been documenting her lies, that he's been warning people, that he's been trying to protect what he built from being exploited by someone who saw him as a commodity from the very beginning. And then his voice breaks slightly as he says he's praying that someone will listen, that someone will remember what he tried to tell them. Because if they don't, Priscilla will spend the next 50 years profiting off his name while Lisa Marie gets whatever scraps her mother decides to allow her. The attorneys were more concerned with avoiding probate complications than honoring a dead man's verbal instructions. And Priscilla, who'd spent years watching and learning and calculating, knew exactly which levers to pull and which people to convince. By the time anyone realized what was happening, she'd secured positions of authority that Elvis had spent his final years trying to prevent her from obtaining. The people who heard Elvis's warnings firsthand have carried that knowledge like a wound for decades. Red West, who heard Elvis predict exactly what Priscilla would do, admitted years later that dismissing those warnings was one of his greatest regrets. He said he'd thought Elvis was being paranoid, that the pills were distorting his perception, that he was seeing conspiracies where there were just normal divorce complications. But watching Priscilla operate after Elvis's death, watching her build an empire on his name while sidelining Lisa Marie from meaningful control, Red realized that Elvis had been right about everything. Joe Esposito, another member of the Memphis Mafia, finally spoke publicly before his death about a conversation he'd had with Elvis in July of 1977. Elvis had told him that Priscilla was going to rewrite history, that she'd spend the rest of her life controlling the narrative about their relationship and his legacy, that she'd make herself the hero and make him look like the fool who couldn't see what she was doing. Joe had laughed it off at the time. Decades later, he wasn't laughing. He was admitting that everything Elvis predicted had come to pass, and the people who should have protected his wishes had failed him completely. But it's the audio recording that surfaced from a private collection that delivers the final devastating blow. Made by Elvis in July of 1977, less than a month before his death, it captures him alone, speaking with a clarity that contradicts any suggestion he was too impaired to understand what he was saying. His voice is tired but firm, sad but certain, and what he says is a prophecy that came true in every detail. He talks about Priscilla rewriting everything after he's gone, about her positioning herself as the guardian of his legacy while pushing his daughter aside. He says he's been documenting her lies, that he's been warning people, that he's been trying to protect what he built from being exploited by someone who saw him as a commodity from the very beginning. And then his voice breaks slightly as he says he's praying that someone will listen, that someone will remember what he tried to tell them. Because if they don't, Priscilla will spend the next 50 years profiting off his name while Lisa Marie gets whatever scraps her mother decides to allow her. The recording ends with Elvis sounding utterly defeated. He knows what's coming. He knows his warnings won't be taken seriously. And he knows that there won't be a damn thing he can do to stop it from his grave. Elvis tried to warn everyone about Priscilla's lies, but his voice was silenced by the very person he was warning about. Now the evidence is finally surfacing. Subscribe to see what else has been buried. Hit that bell. Share this truth. Elvis deserves to be heard.